All right. Yes. So I am working in the neuroscience department at KI, and our lab is interested in modeling things like learning and executive function. And more specifically, we work a lot with working memory and mathematics historically. So that is exactly what this is going to be about. So this is an analysis of a previous data set where we have longitudinal fMRI data of children who have undergone cognitive training. And we're interested in both how different training paradigms impact the brain and also what that can tell us about mathematics learning, essentially. Yeah, so some quick background. As it says here, how educational interventions influence the developing brain is obviously of interest to cognitive neuroscience. That's our standpoint, at least. And there's been a lot of focus on mathematical abilities, mostly because it's associated with higher educational success, acceptance into STEM fields, et cetera. And neuroimaging obviously has the potential to evaluate the neural mechanisms of learning and look for effective training markers that students or educationalists might be interested in, even though there's quite a lot of sort of skepticism with regards to neuroscience from the educational field. So that's partly why we're interested in this type of research, try to see what neuroscience can do for education. And specifically, one of the questions we're interested in this data set looking at is whether brain activation per se or connectivity measures derived from those activation measures are better when we're looking at these types of longitudinal changes. So there's a recent review here, for instance, that have looked into working memory training specifically with regards to activation, and they've seen that there's a lot of variation in the findings in the literature, basically, both with regards to the effect of actual task performance, but also longitudinal changes. So what happens with training, essentially? Do we see activity rise or decrease? Sometimes both, depending on context. So it's a bit complicated, essentially. So what we're going to be looking here more specifically is network connectivity. And we're going to analyze this longitudinal data set. It's 54 6-year-old children, and they've all been divided up into various training regimens. So they have been working about 30 minutes a day for 8 weeks with a digital working memory training app, but it also includes other tasks. So they're training working memory, mathematics, or both. There's also a reading task, which is the sort of control task. So that means there's essentially 4 groups, and we're mostly interested in comparing the working memory group with the group who has trained both working memory and mathematics. And the reason for that is that I'll show you a graph in a couple of seconds to describe why this is of interest. Yeah, so after these children have gone through this cognitive training, we put them in the MRI scanner. They do a simple visual working memory task where you have a grid of 4x4 dots, and an image will flash in these positions in a pattern. And then later on, they're cued with another image in one of the spots. And the task is just to basically say yes or no, did this cue appear in any of the spots that was previously indicated? So it's a fairly simple task. And we're going to be using DCM modeling here, which is a connectivity method that is intended to basically estimate the directionality of connectivity between various nodes in a predefined network that we sort of decide. I'll go a little bit into how it works, but very, very quickly. You have a set of stimulus inputs, usually your experiment in some way, like presentations on the screen or something, which you then feed into a neural state model, which looks something like this. So you have nodes, which represent various brain areas. So you collect your actual data, put it into these nodes. You then define connections between these nodes, and you can also perturb them with various other experimental conditions. You crunch that through a hemodynamic state equation that basically says, given this setup and these inputs, how do we expect the neural signal to look if this is sort of what the connectivity actually looks like, and it spits out the bold signal in the end. So the idea is to compare your generated bold signal with your actual data, and that gives you the measure of sort of how good of a fit this model is for your particular data. So what we did here is we calculated mathematical improvement for these kids across training. So let's just go to the actual image. This is what it looks like. So as the children are training day by day, the algorithm automatically adjusts the difficulty of the tasks. So by taking the average sort of level of difficulty for the tasks across time, you can see the progression. And what's happening here is that across time, you can see that the combined working memory and math group converges from the group that only trained math and reading. So you get a significant difference in outcome in the end. So so here's the behavior. We see a difference between these training conditions. So now we want to see what correlates with that in the brain. That's the idea. So when you run a traditional GLM results analysis on this data, we get this. And we see superior parietal lobule activation, superior frontal gyrus activation, and also visual area. And these three are sort of the top results in our results table. These two are significant whole brain. This one, not quite, but still a trend. And these are the sort of classical areas you see in working memory research and mathematics as well. So what we did essentially is we picked the top three areas, and to that we added the contralateral equivalents. So we get a final sort of model that looks like this. We got the visual node, we got superior parietal, superior frontal, and they're connected intrahemispherically and sort of back to front. So this is our sort of hypothesized model setup for this data. So you extract the data from these 5 nodes in each subject, and that's what you run the model on. And yeah, so this is how it looks. And what you do is you compare the fit of this model to various alternative models as a sort of way to test if this is a reasonable anatomical setup. So in our case, what we did is we just compared it with a full model where we essentially just connected all the nodes in any way they could, and that's a sort of a fully data-driven version. And in terms of fit, our sort of this hypothesis is about twice as good as the full one. So that means that essentially, yeah, it's better. It's supposedly sort of more real, or at least more probably real. So that's like, okay, good enough. We have a sort of model that's better than just what the data would give you analytically, let's say. And what we then do is we say, okay, what we're really interested in is the longitudinal bit. So we have data 2 time points, and the way we model that is we basically treat those time points as one huge experiment, and we add a parameter for time point. So what that gives us in the context of the DCM is you sort of get 2 sets of numbers. You get one set of numbers that represents the average or baseline connectivity, and then you get parameter values that are changes from baseline when you go from time point 1 to time point 2 on average. So we're only going to focus on those numbers really, because that's what we're interested in. And just adding in terms of quality, we see here that for every subject, the average percent variance explained by this model is 44%, which is right in between sort of what we typically see. If you get 10%, that's usually good enough, but it's usually somewhere in the range of 10 to 60% explained variance when you do this type of modeling. So it's also just a way to show that the model isn't like entirely crazy. But what really matters is when you're done your modeling, you get some results, and they look something like this. What I'm showing here is numbers only for the connections that are significant to us. And by that, I mean, we try to predict various covariates from these parameters, right? Because we're interested in if these values represent changes over time due to training, then our questions were, what was the difference between the different training groups? So can we predict training groups from these parameters? So that's what these mean. So the connections marked with an A here, for instance. So that would be the parameter for activity in the visual cortex and the frontal areas here. They were sort of good enough to predict if they had working memory training or not. And for number line training, that's mathematics. If they train mathematics, we would see this connection here from the left superior frontal back to the left superior parietal. This parameter was strong enough to predict if they had mathematical training or not. And for the combined group, those who had both working memory and number line, we see that here. So the two connections between the right superior nodes here can predict if they're in this group or not. So this makes sense because these are sort of the strongest connections that the previous analysis of this data set had indicated as of interest, sort of. But okay, fair enough. We can predict the training groups, but so what? What we really want is to use this model to predict something outside of the model, some additional data. So what we have then is we have a value for math improvement rate. So we saw the improvement rate calculated basically as the slope of increase over the training period that I showed the graph for. And we can actually predict the math improvement rate using parameter for the visual area and the parameter for this connection from the left superior frontal gyrus to the left superior parietal lobe here. So that basically tells us that these parameter values that we get out here, they are actually useful in predicting something that we care about outside of the model. And yeah, so the way that works is essentially you do a leave one out analysis and you run the group model, and then you ask it, you know, given this model, we have a subject here with a parameter value of X. What do you think his math improvement rate is? So you basically get a correlation when you run through every subject, you get a correlation between the actual values and what the model guessed their variable to be. So if you look at the strengths of these, you can see there is somewhere in the range of 2 to 4 sort of correlation between the actual variables and what this model predicted the variables to be based on the connectivity strengths. All right. Now this is not too funny, but okay. So to summarize this, what's the point? Well, we can see that the GLM analysis that I showed before, where we actually selected the areas to extract data from, I didn't mention it, but just comparing the two time points in GLM, we didn't see any significant longitudinal changes, but we could detect them in the DCM model. So that tells you something about potential sort of sensitivity of this connectivity approach. We identified patterns that systematically differed between the group, and they were associated with the mathematical improvement as well. So we sort of shown a reason to care about these values that we extracted. Yeah, so basically increased frontoparietal coupling predicted gains in mathematical performance, while self-inhibition in the visual and frontal regions were linked to working memory training. That's sort of a summary of what I showed there. We could talk about what the parameters actually mean. It's a bit complicated, but the most interesting thing here is really that the point is, if you're looking only at activity levels, it can indicate multiple things, right? It can be differences due to load or time on task. Activity can also decrease as a result of efficiency in the neural network after training, right? And this obviously complicates your analysis if you expect activity to go up or down during your task and then up or down during your training as well. I mean, we don't totally get away from this, but it's just to illustrate the point that it's not as straightforward. It's just putting someone in the scanner and measuring the activity level, and that's it. That's it. So what are we concluding here? Well, we can conclude that working memory, it is needed for mathematical operations. and then the training of this visuospatial working memory or number line tasks exclusively or in combination, that produces these behaviorally relevant differences in effective connectivity, and they are not evident from standard GLM analysis alone. So we need to do this type of connectivity modeling to detect these differences. And this effective connectivity then may serve as a more sensitive and functionally meaningful marker of neuroplasticity than traditional activation-based analysis. And why do we care about this really in the context of education and neuroscience? Well, it's important because the, how to put it? Well, sorry. Yeah, the whole point is if we want to do something useful using neuroscience, you can't really analyze every student in every classroom, right? It's unfeasible. But what you can do is you can evaluate curricula instead. So say you have some particular type of training or course or something, you can either tailor it to influence a specific connection somewhere. If you know that this connectivity change, say, is related to some outcome measure that you care about, you can test basically different courses against each other and evaluate them based on some particular connectivity change. Or you can, tinker with your course, try to basically make it improve what you care about more, better, something like that. So you would use it in a sort of small tailored context to improve teaching material rather than evaluating student outcomes, because obviously that's very variable as well, as everyone knows, due to a multitude of factors in the educational setting, personal and sort of environmental factors. So that's basically the take-home message. And I would like to acknowledge our funders and my nice lab here, Professor Torkel and lab members. And I thank you for your attention, and you're free to ask any questions.